Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is Feb 15, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Cammy Brothers. Thank you so much, Cammy. Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Brookline, Massachusetts, near Boston.
First question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
That's a good broad question. I think for me, anyway, it's hard to generalize, but for me, the things that bring me happiness and a sense of satisfaction are really loving what I do and being around people I care about and love and find friendship and joy with.
Yes. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Well, I guess I've had a lifetime habit of reading the morning paper and with coffee. I'm one of the holdouts who still subscribes to a physical paper, and I really like having material things. So I think I like the physicality of reading, and both with newspapers and with books. I recently ordered a new book that I was interested in reading, and it came as a kind of crummy paper bag with unappealing paper, and I'm enough of a aesthete about these things that I sent it back and got a secondhand physical copy or hardbound copy that has better paper. So I guess I care about those kind of physical aspects of reading. I like, with my kids, I sometimes watch documentaries, and I really enjoy documentaries, or with students, I sometimes show them things like Nova documentaries on architecture.
Yeah.
So I like other forms of
Yeah.
information too, but I'm partial to physical forms of reading.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I appreciate what you just said a lot. And just to divert on reading, did you become a reader because your parents told you to? They did it as an example or on your own?
So I have a probably slightly unusual relationship to reading because my mother worked at the Writers' Workshop in Iowa City, and so I went to readings. She was a single parent and didn't. I had some babysitters, but I guess she didn't have that many babysitters for me in the evenings. And part of her job was to organize readings of poetry and fiction several times a week. So probably from the time I was about 6, I would go to poetry and fiction readings a couple nights a week, at least through when I was a teenager, and then I didn't have to go anymore. So just listening to people speak or read their stories and fiction and poems was part of my upbringing. And I've thought about that because I think even though style isn't really something that art historians or academics are trained to be attentive to at all, it's something that I care about a lot, both as a reader and as a writer. And I think that comes from just kind of taking it in. But that's really more that wasn't answering the question directly. It's just about an experience I had. We also, growing up, my mother read stories out loud to me a lot. We'd kind of switch off reading when I got older. So it was a real source of pleasure. It was definitely not something but it was also a family activity in a way. It definitely wasn't something that I was made to do. I guess I was made to go to the readings, but.
Yeah, it was like a ritual. She taught you how to appreciate the printed word. How cool is that? So why do you think humans collect or gather information?
That's interesting. I guess I've thought more about why they collect or gather artifacts. Can I
Yeah.
answer that question instead?
Of course, that's what I said. You put it into the context you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, uh, I think it's really fascinating how people collect things that are important to them, and, we've all been exposed to the idea of, clearing our lives of clutter through Marie Kondo and the kind of, aesthetic of the minimalist house, but I think it's equally interesting how, the kind of um, sentimental opposition to that, which is that many of us fill our lives with things that have um, memories or associations, whether they're souvenirs or things that were given to us by our parents or our grandparents, things that just associate us with different parts of our life. And I had this interesting experience in a class recently. We were talking about this. It's a class I teach on the art of science and the science of art, and we were talking about the formation of early museums through Wunderkammer or uh, cabinets of curiosities, where in the
Yeah.
early modern period, people would just collect a lot of things. And so I went around the class and just asked students if there was anything they collected. And, maybe it was self-selected because, or self-selecting because these were kids who chose to take my class. But anyway, every single student, all these, 18 to 21-year-olds had some particular type of object that they had their own little curated collections of. I was slightly
Yeah.
shocked, and many of them had brought them from home, some, as far away as Korea or North Dakota or whatever. They'd brought them to their dorm rooms, and these were things that kind of made them feel at home. So that's a form of collecting. And I think the objects that I find fascinating, and the objects you said, how do people collect information? But the objects are containers of information. They're
Oh, yeah.
just in a non-textual way.
You're really good, Cammy. You put it into the context you want, and you really are articulate. I appreciate any anecdotes or stories like that. Really flushes out a bigger picture for me. I really appreciate it. And so, is this need or want to collect information, artifacts, more innate or more invented by humans?
Every society and culture that I've ever heard about does that, except for possibly nomadic cultures. Maybe do it a little less, but every kind of culture that settles seems to collect artifacts or keep artifacts, say, or create them and value them.
Yeah.
So um, it it seems it seems innate to me. I think
Yeah.
aspects of it are learned, in the sense that if you go to, I always find it fascinating to see, to go to people's houses and see what's around. And there are some now, uh, I'm I have the experience with some friends that I've known for years, that I've seen their parents' house because we were friends in college or friends in high school, and now I see their houses. And there's often this kind of intergenerational pattern. Sometimes it's because they've kept the paint, they now have inherited or whatever,
Yeah.
gotten the paintings that were on the walls of their parents' houses. But I think it's more than that. So so I think both things are true. I think that it seems to be innate in humans and in across many cultures and times to collect objects, but then there are also certainly cultural patterns, that are, and familial patterns that repeat themselves.
Really good. Do thoughts create emotions?
Yes. Do thoughts create emotions? Well, I guess I would resist the dichotomy. I don't know if you know the work of, I bet you do, of Antonio Damasio, he's
Yeah.
a neuroscientist, but I think it's called maybe Against Descartes, or Descartes'
Yeah.
Error was one of his books.
Yeah.
Um, and he's resisting that idea that kind of rationality and emotion exist in two different spheres.
Yeah.
Uh, and I certainly think that's intuitively, I think that's right. I
Yeah.
think that we think that our rational mind and our emotional mind are separate spheres, but I've never found that to be true.
Yeah, because you can't separate thinking from feeling, but we think we can because we invented the words.
Right. We think we can. And there are, I guess the other reason I would resist it is because there are all these kind of uh historically kind of gendered ways in which those two things have been thought of,
Yeah.
that women are hysterical, or that women can't,
Yep.
their thought is clouded by their emotions, they can't make rational decisions as leaders because they're too emotional, all of these things. Even the way we respond to female political leaders, that, oh, they sound angry or they sound shrill and so
Yeah.
forth. I feel like all of these are colored by the notion that it's possible to separate
Yep.
thought and emotion, whereas I really don't think anyone can. I think it's, as you said, it's just a kind of either linguistic convention or and maybe we can blame Descartes. I don't know, a kind of intellectual tradition that makes us think that we can separate them.
Yep. Fill in the blank, Cammy. I don't know what I think until I.
Well, in my realm, that is mostly um, visual. So I would say I don't know what I think until I see it. And so sometimes I'm asked about, do I think this particular drawing might be by Michelangelo or something like that? And I feel like when I see something in my field of art history, if I see the original work, I have a response, I have an opinion, I have a reaction, but it's very much about the firsthand encounter. So I would say see it is
Very
my
good.
real.
Yeah. McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. But can humans think without language?
So the McLuhan quote that you mentioned
Yeah.
reminded me of one of my favorite essays that I used or referred to in the introduction to my first book on Michelangelo, which is by Kleist, the German writer, which is called "On the Formulation of Thoughts While Speaking."
Yeah.
And it's this fabulous short essay. I'm sure you'd love it if you don't know it already, where he talks about how the entire way that thought operates is in its articulation, and he gives these wonderful and kind of surprising historical examples. So he gives a example of the tennis court oath, and how at that moment so this crucial moment in the French Revolution, and he analyzes the speech, and he's like, at that point, the speaker had no idea how he was going to finish the sentence, and then this happened, and then this is where he knew how to finish it. And then he also talks about how when he's working out his stories, he talks to his maid, and she may or may not understand what he's talking about, but it doesn't matter because he just needs to kind of say it out loud. And I think anyone who teaches knows that that's true, that you
Yeah.
can, may have certainly when I first started teaching, I had these like elaborate scripts, but now I have a kind of idea, and part of the pleasure of teaching is that you figure out what you think about things as you're saying them.
As you're going along, that's the more you practice, the luckier you get.
Yeah, absolutely.
But,
Exactly. The closer approximation.
yeah, but Cleese is spelled. How do you spell that?
Oh, yeah, I think it's Kleist, but Kleist. Heinrich von Kleist, and he wrote a lot of wonderful kind of I don't know if you call it magical realism, but it was like that, like kind of in stories where someone becomes mysteriously pregnant, but genuinely mysteriously, or that's the Marquise von O. But then also a few essays, which are really wonderful.
Yeah, beautiful. Can humans think without language?
So I saw this essay, or it was a book review recently of, I know I'm going to forget her name, but it was about visual thinking. It's on the edge of my tongue, but an author who's written a recent book on visual thinking, and the book review, I think it might have been in the New Yorker, was talking about this kind of all these experiments that have been done over time about different ways that people think. So, for example, one that I find interesting is about if we imagine a pre-Google Maps cell phone time, and you think about how do you navigate a city that maybe you've been in once, but you don't know well, and can you take in information? So if you're lost in a city you don't know, and someone says to you, yeah, if you to get where you're going, just take 2 rights and a left, and then go over the bridge and take another left. So if you said that to me, I'd be completely befuddled. I would have no idea what to do after about 2 feet, because I have trouble telling my right and left apart, and I don't think about space linguistically.
Yeah.
But I'm really good at navigating cities that I've been, like, I don't know, years ago, I was trying to find a restaurant in Venice. This was pre-cell phone, and I'd only been there once, and it was like across the city, and I just found it. And that was because I remembered like the visual cues that had gotten me there, even though it had been several years. So I know that I think very visually, and I think some people also think in images. My memory works in images. So I think, yes, we can think without words and without language, but I also think it's quite individual.
Yeah. It's amazing. You must have ESP, because underneath their first page of notes, my backup was that very article.
Oh, okay.
I've been using it as a discussion prompt, and
Yeah,
it's amazing.
fascinating.
It's Temple Grandin's
Temple
book.
Grandin, I
Yeah,
couldn't remember
visual
her name.
thinking: the hidden gifts of people who think in pictures, patterns, and abstraction.
Yeah,
Really
it's on
good.
my reading list, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. So Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do, Cammy, when language breaks down? When language doesn't work, what do you do?
So I really love languages, and for example, I know a few European languages, but Italian I'm fluent in Italian, and I find, and I'm sure this is true for other people who have another fluent language, or bilingual people or whatever, is that if I'm stuck expressing a thought in English, my mind goes to the Italian phrase. And the other thing that happens to me is that I want to draw. And I do that sometimes. If I try to always have a notebook with me, and if I'm talking to someone and I stuck trying to explain something, then I try to diagram it or draw it. And also, if someone's trying to explain something to me and I don't understand it, then I pick up a pen and paper. So yeah.
That was good. These are 2 questions from Alan Turing, 1950s. 1, is thinking a function of the soul?
Well, what's the soul?
Well, you win, because this series is all about inventing new questions. So you should hear how many people respond that exact way. That is really a lot. And again, what we're doing is what Lily Tomlin says: reality is just a collective hunch. We think we know what words mean in general. So that's why I say you put the questions into the context you want. But things will come back around too. The second Turing question is, can machines think?
Yeah. So I was reading something interesting about that. You know, in my world of university teaching, there's all sorts of worries and discussion about chat, whatever GP. I don't even remember the acronym correctly. GPT or something.
PDT, correct.
Yeah, and artificial intelligence, and are we going to start to get all of our papers as generated by AI? But I saw an interesting essay about it over the weekend. I can't remember the author. It was just randomly something I saw on Twitter, but it was basically saying, like, look, there's this tradition of introducing chance and randomness into writing, and so this is just doing it in a different way. Like, and I think it was pointing to things like data experiments with automatic writing, or the person who, you see those refrigerator magnets where there's a bunch of words and you kind of like switch them around. That was invented by someone whose name I can't remember, as a form of automatic writing. And so what I thought of, what this person didn't say in the essay, but what I thought of reading it, was that actually in these, it's the reception where the thought takes place. So like in this, you're not asking specifically about AI, but the way that I would put it is that, so I don't think machines can think, but machines in generating things can produce material that we can think about, and we can maybe think about them in potentially interesting ways. And so it's that, so they can start a dialogue, and we can respond with thought.
Yeah. Really good. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
That's interesting. Why was I thinking about that lately? Not exactly in those terms, but I was thinking about, I think there's some song in the radio. I can't remember who wrote it, who did it, but it was like, if you ask me if I'm happy, that's when I cease to be. And I was thinking about that because when I was growing up, I think my mother tried to instill some kind of value about, like, what you're pursuing is a happy life. Like, you're trying to, none of the other goals really matter. That's what matters. But so she'd say, well, like, when I was away at college, are you happy, or da da da? And I always felt very resistant to the question, because I just felt like, who can tell? And like, it depends on what time of day. Have I had breakfast yet? Am I had my coffee? If I not had my coffee, am I like, was someone just mean to me, or did I have a nice interaction? Like, it's very relative to the moment. I guess I feel like maybe neither. I think I feel like what's directed my life is trying to do things that I find fulfilling, and things that I enjoy on a kind of day-to-day basis in terms of their practice, and that aren't totally that are give me pleasure but aren't totally self-indulgent. And I guess that's why, like, teaching and writing have felt like a good kind of combination. I guess the happiness in itself is a tough one, because like
it is good, because see, some of these questions I give you either or, and there's could be a million other choices, and that's what you did. That's good. And again, here's another more one, but does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we creating it?
Well, I would do the same thing that I did with the soul one, which was like, what's consciousness?
Right.
I mean, do we detect it or create it? I have no idea. I don't know.
That's fine. Let's move on, because all this stuff comes back
Too
around.
deep for me.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
I'm sure for me it's the speed of light.
There's a poet, Audre Lorde. She said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rayner responded, said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
To dismantle the master's house. Yeah, that's interesting. Where my mind went was to a class that I took in college called Modern Political Ideology, or maybe it's called Modern Political Thought, but it was about ideology. It was by, I think, Stanley Hoffman and Judith Shklar. And it was this really mind-opening class because it went through history and at all these and examined, I think a lot of it was focused on revolutions and basically said, you know, like with the French Revolution, this happened not just because people organized or this army organized or they killed the king or whatever, but because of an idea, because of this revolutionary idea. And they were able to kind of understand that the whole system of aristocracy and feudalism was not necessary. They could have there were other ways of thinking about things. And I guess I've and the other thing that comes to mind is in high school, I had this slightly unusual experience, maybe of, I think for the US anyway, of in my European history class, the teacher had a grad student from the University of Iowa teach a unit on Marxism. And so we read the Communist Manifesto, which I'm guessing like not many high school students in Iowa were reading. And my mind was blown. Like, I thought this was so fascinating. And it kind of, again, was a moment of exposing ideology. So this is not really answering your question, but my point is that I think any kind of dismantling of anything requires first realizing the system that you're in. And to me, that in those kind of intellectual experiences of understanding what ideology is, that it's this kind of unspoken set of assumptions that we live within, is really helpful.
Yeah, that's good. Great answer. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Well, I have children and I worry about having to wake up with them. I'm naturally a late night person and I like to sleep in. And sometimes now they're old enough that they let me, but I worry about it.
Very good. A concerned mother. I love it. McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound, the poet, that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so we might be able to cope with what we don't like about the inventions. So, Cammy, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Well, I think they're often uncomfortable. I think, you know, if you, no matter what it is that artists are bringing us, it's often some kind of slightly uncomfortable, difficult truth to look at. So I don't know if this is an odd example, but I saw the Philip Guston show recently that was controversial because it was the curators made a decision to put it off because they felt like the politics were kind of like might be misinterpreted.
Yeah.
So I saw it at the Museum of Fine Arts, and there were all these warnings. There were warnings about like, the content may be disturbing and so on and so forth. But here's Guston. I mean, these paintings are funny. Like, I didn't understand his paintings of the Ku Klux Klan in these, like, they look smoking cigars, like they look ridiculous, and it's really they're hilarious. And he was this anti-racist he was really very sympathetic to the civil rights movement and active in the civil rights movement. And these paintings mocking the Ku Klux Klan were part of it. But it's like we can't see the humor in them, or people are afraid of the humor, and I don't know if then they were able to look at it. But it's in any case, it's kind of, like, uncomfortable for us to deal with in polite society, and
Yeah.
I think that that's often true. I mean, that's just one example of kind of slight political art, but approached in a way that, um, is specific to painting and specific to art. But, um, yeah, I think there are lots of examples like that.
Well done, because you anticipated the next question. Do artists have moral obligation?
I think humans have moral obligations, uh, and artists are humans.
There you go. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
I have a memory. So I was born in Berkeley. I grew up in Iowa, but I was born in Berkeley, California, and I have a memory of being in someone's house, and, it was this kind of big, uh, loft-like dark house, and there was a big fish tank in it, and I remember the fish tank, and I have maybe I could verify that, but probably not. But it's a very visual memory of, like, the space and
Yeah.
this kind of, like, gallery-like dark space with this illuminated fish tank. That's my earliest memory. I moved left Berkeley when I was 5, so sometime before that.
Yeah. Please tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model, and what specifically was that impact?
Yeah, so my great uncle, which is not quite immediate family, but he was very important to our family, and he was a role model for me. He was a poet. His name is Robert Lax, and he lived most of his adult life on a Greek island. Um, and he published lots of books, and he was reasonably well known in Switzerland and parts of Europe, I think mostly the German-speaking world, not super well known in the US, although, he had a lot of, or I guess he's in the US, he's known mostly because he was a correspondent of, Thomas Merton, who,
Yeah.
is a well-known theologian, and their letters were published. But he was a everyone in my family really looked up to him, and it was a very I spent some time working with him on Patmos, where he lived, helping him. But um, and I was exposed to I read his poems early on, and I wrote poetry, and I kind of imitated his. But I think it was mainly because he was living this very kind of pure life in a certain way. You know, um, there was seemed to be so little ego in his writing or his way of pursuing a career. He never pursued fame. He didn't try to kind of like make relationships with publishers. People came to his poetry or not. Um,
Yeah.
and he lived so simply. So it's slightly unattainable for more normal people, but it was a role model, and I think, and also like the fact that he lived so modestly and so humbly, but people were really drawn to him as a person. A very warm, funny person.
Beautifully put. I can't wait to check him out because I'm a huge Thomas Merton fan.
Oh,
So
oh, I love him.
that's that's inside. How about outside your immediate family?
Um, let's see. I mean, my teachers as an undergraduate, had a big impact on me. These were Howard Burns and John Shearman. These were undergraduate teachers who then I went back to at Harvard, and then I went back there for graduate school to work with them. And they were just um, incredibly knowledgeable and generous and excellent writers. So I think as scholars, they were very important models for me.
Were you raised a particular religion?
I was raised Jewish.
And do you pray?
Rarely. Yeah, not a lot.
If God exists, what would you like to say to you?
I'm gonna pass.
Do evil that's fine. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
I prefer not to think about evil. I find it a problematic concept. I'm gonna pass on that one too.
No, that's fine. Believe me, there's no pressure. This is good. And this question is sort of a follow-up. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
So,
Coppola, yeah, go ahead.
so I didn't mention before, as an influential figure in my family, my grandmother, but she was also influential, and she, I think, taught both my mother and my aunt a philosophy of kill them with kindness.
Oh,
And
that's good.
I try to do the same. So basically, if you kind of try to overwhelm whoever's being mean to you with generosity and see if that does anything.
You cut to the chase. That's beautiful. I agree with that 100%. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Oh, it's so much better in the play. It's it's I mean, plays are fabulous. Oh my gosh. But and all of it, also with I think they're better reflections of our life. That's true, I would
Yeah.
say, going to museums or plays, and it's also, I think, a form of heightened attention.
Yeah.
So we hear so much and live so much about distraction in our societies, and that's certainly just a fact of life, probably increased in whatever the cell phone era, the internet era, all that. Um, but but if you're in a play, you're focused and you're all there. And the same thing, hopefully, I guess it's not necessarily so in a museum, but I think you can learn to focus in a museum and learn to be attentive. And then that's a really wonderful way of being. People talk about, flow in terms of like a creative flow and creative flow that you get into in writing. But I think that maybe you'd use a different word, but I feel like maybe that similar idea of flow in relation to being attentive to something that you're experiencing, whether it's dance or music or theater, all I think in a live format where you just kind of feel in harmony with or incredibly just keyed in to what's happening in front of you. And that's such a fabulous experience.
Really great use of words. I love it because it's so much better. And the flow thing, man, I had a woman yesterday. She just went in. She's been teaching screenwriting for 27 years. She just went into the flow thing. Really well put. And so, Cammy, just sort of walk us through. It sounds like you had an incredible mother who, took you to these writing workshops. You had this great uncle. You're exposed to poetry. And I imagine your mom's taking you to art galleries and art museums growing up or being exposed to art. Where's the tipping point where you said, that's the career I want to pursue? Art, architecture, and being an educator. Where's your tipping points?
Yeah. I think it didn't feel like a decision really. So I guess so once I was in art history, there was a decision about getting in art history, and that was kind of a like an accident almost. But once I was in art history, it felt less like a decision. So I'd always done, I'd always drawn and painted from a very young age. So I was, I mean, I went to museums and there was a great art museum at the University of Iowa, and so I'd go to that quite a bit. And whenever we travel, we would go to museums. So I was, and we didn't travel that much, but I had relatives in Chicago and relatives in New York, and we'd go to museums there. So I was exposed to art in those settings. But I had no idea art history was a thing. Like I just hadn't. I mean, yeah, I hadn't heard of it really. And so in college, I was studying history and literature. That was like a joint major. And then, but I don't know, I was a little dissatisfied. And I had a couple of friends who told me about art history. And so I took just one class. I tried it. And I just couldn't believe my luck. It just seemed fabulous. And then, I don't know, I think some people had a sense of mission about being a teacher. I don't think I did. I love teaching, but that's kind of lucky. Like it's like a little bit by chance. I wasn't driven to become a teacher. I think I just liked what I was doing in college. And so it seemed like natural to keep studying it. And um, I also I like to spend a lot of time alone, so I could never picture myself with, like, a office job. I thought that would just drive me nuts. So it just kind of, like, seemed like a good idea to just keep doing like a PhD just seemed like a way of keep doing what I was doing. But I didn't when I first started teaching, I was kind of like, "Wait, did I decide to do this? When did I make this decision?"
Right.
And I sort of didn't. Fortunately, I like it, but that yeah, that's luck.
Well, it's also book writing. You've written books, and a screenwriting teacher told me great art, great book is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film or great book or great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing a book?
That's interesting. Well, it's interesting because I think it's for scholarship, um, it's quite different than for fiction but also within my work, I think, my scholarly so I've written 2 scholarly books now, and then for the last 10 years, I think the way that you came across me is, I've done these short pieces, for the Wall Street Journal, and I think maybe there's an interesting distinction to be made in intention just in those 2 forms of writing, kind of scholarly writing versus public writing. Um,
Yeah.
and so with public writing, that's been like really a joy for me and a privilege because I feel like the intention is so clear in my mind. Like my intention is here are these Renaissance artists. I, by virtue of my education, know a huge amount about them. Um, and by virtue of luck, am able to write about them in a forum that reaches a lot of people. And so I'm trying to bring context and information and a sense of kind of pleasure or interest to this broad public through my writing. And I'm trying to say something about whatever show I've seen, but um, criticizing the show is kind of secondary usually in my intentions to kind of sharing information about the context of the artist and what
No.
they've done and so forth. Um, the scholarly books are totally different in intention in the sense that they're like you see there's something that you want to say, there's a problem that I or an absence or lack that I perceive in the way that a architect that I find fascinating has been dealt with before, and so I want to share my insight about that person and change the perception and reception of that architect. um, I guess one thing that's been really interesting to me over the past year is I've been giving a lot of book talks on my new book, and um, then you get to meet all these people. I've been doing them in person, so you get to meet a lot of people who've read the book, um, and in Italy, book presentations are actually done by another scholar presenting your work. So then you get to hear how they read the work, and that's it's fascinating because you see like either my intentions like totally were successful and got through or not, or like how the work is perceived and received is really interesting. That's been fun.
Well, you really distinguish it well because, it's much easier for fiction writers to say that. And it's like for nonfiction, it's like, well, intention is blah, blah, blah. So that was good between the scholarly and public. And I think it was interesting what you said earlier, Cammy, is that you were raised in this creative writing atmosphere. And it sounds like you went into scholarly and public writing knowing I can still have some style here. It doesn't have to be dry writing. And Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader in both case, scholarly and public writing, when you're writing your piece or book?
I think about the reader all the time, and I think that's a mistake that some scholars make, is not thinking about that. I mean, it's not just scholars, but there's a lot of nonfiction writing that's not I mean, writing that's in commercial presses and so forth, I think usually goes through an editorial process that's really rigorous. And so by the time it reaches the public, it's pretty legible. But a lot of scholarly writing is very dense. And I can only think that there's not enough thought about communication and the reader. But so when I'm doing scholarly writing, I often have a kind of imagined interlocutor, like some scholar that, and it's not totally imagined, like it may be someone who I send the chapter to,
Yeah.
but it may also just be someone who I think, well, this person's going to really care about this. What do I want to say to that person? And I try to do it a lot I've been giving a lot of talks and lectures lately, and I try to do it a lot with those. It can be challenging because, like I gave a lecture at the National Gallery in Washington recently, and it was very fun, but it was also slightly nerve-wracking because I knew that there would be a lot of just like people who go to all the lectures there, the kind of public, and then there would also be people in my field, and trying to satisfy like people really knowledgeable and for whom it's totally a new subject is tricky, but it's always on my mind.
Yeah. Whenever I do public speaking, I stand there by the door and talk to each person as they come in. I go, what are your aspirations in life or whatever? So I can direct it right to them, because you don't know. If you don't know your audience, it's like, whoa.
Yeah, exactly.
So McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness. He says human sensorium. Knife and fork extend our teeth. The shutter in a camera extends our eyelid. Even non-tangible, maybe a religion or philosophy extends consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? Whether it's typewriter or a pen, what humanness does it extend?
Yeah, I think that's actually pretty easy in my case, that I think it's about my visual perception. So
Yeah.
I think I have I mean, through training, I think one of the things that art history does is that it trains you to see. but then I think over time as an art historian, you also develop this really rich visual memory. And so when I look at a painting or a building, I'm not just perceiving what's in front of me. And this isn't unique to me. I think it's true for any art historian. I'm also thinking of all these sets of relationships and echoes of other things I've seen. And it calls to mind a whole series of associations. And so when I write, I'm trying to render some of that.
Yeah, it's beautiful because McLuhan said, sort of tongue in cheek, the film extends your foot because you travel. So, you know, this was a key word for him, you saying perception, because he teased people to believe his percepts were concepts, you know. So that's like, you're not supposed, when you're in academia, you're supposed to present concepts, but you're doing this, you're extending your visual perception. That's really good. I love that. And you said this word truth, or, you know, this, we're uncomfortable with the truth earlier on. And Louis Buñuel, the filmmaker, said, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. And it's a great little cute quote. And most people go, yeah, I love that. And one person challenged me and says, no, that's not right. Because if I'm going to pursue something, it's because I want to find it. And so I sort of morphed it into this question. The cliche goes that the journey's more important than the destination. Why do we have to seek or name a destination if the journey's more important?
Let's see. I mean, I think that the destination is fluid often for me.
Yeah.
That, you know, you figure out, it's a little bit, I would bring it back to the discovery of thoughts while speaking ideas.
Yeah.
Like, figure out where you're going by walking in some direction. And that's, I mean, that's advice that I give students who are stuck on writing projects, and I try to give myself, is like, if I don't know what I'm trying to say, just try to start writing, and you figure it out. And maybe, you know, and then in the editing process, you see that you've gone in 5 different directions, or you've contradicted yourself, or, you know, whatever, and hopefully you figure that out. But I think without launching yourself in some direction, you can't know where you're going.
It's really amazing, Cammy, because I ask these questions because I want to hear people say certain answers. But if they don't, it's fine. It's enabling me to see a bigger picture. But what you did was you described what that is hidden in that question, is that's called flaneur or psychogeography.
Mm-hmm.
The people who changed the world in Paris in the 1920s were just drinking coffee at a cafe and slacking out, and they didn't have direction. They were just wandering aimlessly. And Joyce nailed it. He said, have an epiphany in everydayness, that you can have epiphanies in everydayness. So I really want to explore, I'm intrigued by your interest in art and science. What's the difference between art and science?
Not as much as we think. main impulse is that these have been construed as totally at odds, and even I think there's like these very exaggerated cultural notions of the artist as this kind of like you know, free, unfettered, maybe a little bit wacky personality, and the scientist like all rational and all business and all that. But one thing is, I think that a lot of art and a lot of science is based on observation, kind of close observation of the world, and kind of questions and curiosity about the world. It's more obvious. I mean, when I teach a course on this, and then I situate it in the Renaissance, because then it's it's very obvious that there's no distinction. A figure like Leonardo da Vinci is one that I think it continuously fascinates us, partly because it was so clear that when he's drawing water or something like that, it's not just because he's interested in hydrology, he's interested in how it looks, and he's going to put that in the painting, and it's all very connected. But there are other fields like cartography or anatomy or zoology, which in the early modern period had either collaborations between naturalists and artists, or those were actually the same person. And I think it's really unfortunate that we have kind of inherited this idea that these are pursuits that are very much at odds. I think they have a lot in common.
Yeah, it's really well done, because this French archaeologist historian said, "Science finds no truths. It discovers unknown facts that can be interpreted 1,000 ways."
Yeah, I think that's nicely put. I think well, okay, so then there's also, I think, a kind of like insider outsider problem with both art and science, in the sense
Yeah.
that I think if you talk to scientists, like talk to a chemist or talk to a physicist or whatever, they'll freely admit how much of their work is speculative, and how much is of their discoveries are due to chance, and how much is kind of like open to interpretation. I think it's rare to find someone who would insist that everything is exactly as they say, or and on the other hand, I think many people who have never met an artist would be really surprised how extremely methodical they are, how research driven they are, how they pursue a particular goal like over time, and have a kind of trial and error process. So I think there's a lot of kind of misperceptions and misinformation about both scientists and artists.
Yeah. It evoked Thelonious Monk, the great jazz pianist, said, "Music is math." And, his stuff is so free and filled with space, you would think, wait a minute. So Einstein said that the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. So there's that true word again. And I love the word mystery, because the poet Auden sort of said that the mystery of art is that we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. If you're an artist, you want to think, well, I hope this does something to you, but maybe it will just chill you out and you'll just zone out. Like, Brecht said, I want art that will, not be a trance. Well, some art that puts you in a trance could eventually activate you. So again, there's that full spectrum of how these things affect us, shape our behavior. So the fact that Einstein used this word, he's praising mystery, and he's saying that mystery is the true source of all art and science. That's ironic, because the word science itself is the fact of knowing. So how do you deal with this? I don't even have a question there, but how do you deal with this? The mystery of art is whether it activates or pacifies us, or just this word mystery, because I know in your exploration of art and architecture, maybe it should be, what role does mystery play? I don't know. You can help me formulate a question there, or
Yeah.
just, use it as a prompt, whatever.
Yeah, sure. I mean, let's see. I would do something a little different with it, which is, I guess I'd say, in what I do, I wouldn't talk so much about mystery, but maybe incompleteness or imperfection or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
Some of the some useful literary criticism that I read at one point, I think it was Michel Refrater, and he was writing about poems, and uh, it was talking, I'm probably doing a poor job of summarizing this, but he was talking about how hard it is to describe what's happening in a poem because you are describing with a certain form of language what has a totally different form of language. And if you just say, well, the poem's about a flower, you've
Yeah.
really said nothing because what the poem is actually doing has everything to do with the choice of language. And there are a lot of banal things that may be about a flower, and we don't actually want information about the flower. And so, and I think art history or descriptions of art are similar to that. So think about a painting or a building. Let's just say a building, because a building is even more complicated in a way. Like a complex, think of, the most beautiful church you've ever been in, or the most kind of like amazing space you've ever been in. How hard is that to describe in words? It's really hard because it's around your body. It's your eyes are going all these different places. Your head is moving. You're having sensual experiences or sensory experiences of how cold the building is, or how you might touch the walls. And then and then you're probably not writing about it while you're there. I usually try to, but you're probably like later looking at pictures and trying to remember what that is. Of course, not all art history is description, but description can be an important part of it. And just that there's a huge distance, just like describing a poem, between your experience and how you can render it in words. I wouldn't call that mystery. I would just call that like distance or imperfection or incompleteness or something. But it's like you just have to acknowledge that it's not going to completely get there. And I find that interesting. I think it's like it's a rich thing to think about how hard that is.
Cammy, it is very rich. In fact, you evoked two great ones. Robert Frost was asked, "What does this poem mean?" And he said, "You mean you want me to say it worse?"
That's a good one. Yeah.
And Frank Zappa said, "Writing about music is like trying to dance about architecture." The thing is, you could dance about architecture and we can write about music, but it isn't. So here's the big one, of course, and there's so much on this. Your hunch, because you could probably talk about this for hours. What was the motive of the cave artist?
Hmm.
You're
overestimating me. I don't know if I could talk about it for even a minute. Yeah, it's interesting. So I can't remember where I heard this discussion, and I really don't know much about it, but I heard some discussion about, and you might be interested in this because of all your questions about language, about whether people who work on kind of early man and stuff like that think language or drawing or writing was prior, like, so, and is there a necessary priority of one to the other? I have no idea, and I can't remember how that goes.
You mean, wait, just to clarify, you mean which came first, language or writing? Like making it
not writing, but like mark making.
Marking on the cave wall.
Yeah.
And it's hard to distinguish which came
Right,
first.
mark
There's
making.
another question I ask musicians is, what's more fundamental, language or music? It's sort of like, anyways, go ahead. This is good. So what came first, language or
that's what I said, but your question was, what was the motive?
What is the motive is the question.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it was some form of communication, but maybe it was, but yeah, I don't know. Communication. It was, I really don't know. I have not spent a huge amount of time thinking about wall paintings, or wall art. But it has been, Yeah, there are certain, so there's a kind of, subset of art historians who are interested in basically telling the whole story of art. And I mean, there's Gombrick's story of art, but then I think John O'Nyans is an art historian who got interested in the whole story of art from so he was interested in neuro art history. And so
Yeah,
that he got really interested in these, in cave paintings, because that seemed to be like some way of getting at the brain and how it was expressing itself. And yeah, it was all a bit too deep for me. I found it. I'm not sure. Like, I don't know. I haven't thought a lot about that. It's it feels difficult to contemplate because
yeah,
there's not so much information. Like, one of the things
yeah,
that I love about the period that I work on, about the Renaissance, is people were writing about art, and so uh,
yeah,
I don't have to just trust my instincts. I can read a lot of what, there was essentially art criticism already, and so
yeah,
you can read a lot of other people. And so when I'm trying to interpret what Michelangelo was doing or Giuliano da Sangallo was doing, I don't just have to trust myself. But in the case of cavemen, you pretty much have to trust yourself,
yeah,
because there's no other sources.
yeah,
So I guess I shy away from it a little bit.
yeah. No, I understand. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Like in an argument. Probably compromise.
Very good. Like I said, there's no right or wrong answers, but that one you got right, Cammy. Um, T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Uh, you mean literally? Like, is it in
No,
English?
it's actually more metaphorically. Yeah.
Oh, although the literal answer is funny, because that's because when I travel now, I do like I have a lively inner dialogue all the time, and I mean, I'm constantly talking to myself in my head, and and it does go to Italian when I'm in Italy, and my inner voice is Italian, and it has a different personality.
You mean when you're in America, your inner voice is in English, and when you're in Italy, it's in
It's in
Italian.
Italian, but also the Italians, as you know, like, there are a lot of, like, gestures like, "Hi, why are you doing this?" And,
Right.
"Perché, ma?" And my inner voice becomes, like, more gestural or more, like, emphatic when I but that's not the question you were asking. So your question was, but,
Well, you
metaphorically?
sort of well, as soon as I asked it, you sort of answered it earlier. You're like a visual thinker, you said.
I'm a visual thinker, but I do talk to myself as
Yeah,
well. So, I don't know, I guess it's both.
yeah.
I definitely, like, my dreams are very visual. I mentioned that because I interviewed, a writer I grew up with, James Allen McPherson, Jim McPherson, when I was in college, and I remember, I don't know if it made it into the interview, but I remember him talking about how he dreamed in paragraphs, and
Wow.
yeah, isn't that intense? Um,
Yeah.
and, that's gotta be pretty rare, but I certainly don't dream in paragraphs.
Well, two of my film heroes have this mantra: ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor, the jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Again, it's a stupid question, I know, but just a prompt to your thoughts on this. Is art making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever technologies, cultures, and environments are dominant?
Well, I think I maybe neither. I think, none of the above. I think self-expression is, I find that problematic as a notion, and maybe, like, kind of culturally specific, in the sense that I feel like, um, American culture really emphasizes, the self, and the self
Yeah,
as this, like, creative center, and, like, "What do you wanna say?" and da da da.
yeah,
Um, and but traditional societies, or it didn't, I mean, basically other centuries and other societies didn't think of the artist as someone who is self-expressive. Like Leonardo da Vinci didn't think of himself as self-expressive. Michelangelo didn't either. They were
Yeah.
working for people. They were like, make me a Madonna.
Yeah.
Lorenzo de Medici was like, make me a Madonna already. As of yesterday. Like, so they were considered more elevated than craftspeople, but it certainly wasn't about the self. And I don't even know that I mean, artists I don't know even that they would describe what they're doing as self-expression. I think it's, you feel driven to do it. Or writers I grew up with, like, I can't remember who said it, but I remember one person saying, like, the only reason to be a writer is because you can't do anything else.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of artists feel that way too. Like, there's just kind of like, what else are you gonna do? And let's see, what was the other option aside from
the other was, it's very interesting because no one's really said that, none of the above. It's not self-expression. You're not a vehicle for what cultures are dominant or environment.
Yeah, I don't think you're a vehicle either. I think it's I mean, I also
think it's
calling. What?
Yeah, that's just what I was thinking. You're saying calling. You think it's
No, I don't like calling either. I'm also not that. Because
how about compulsion?
Maybe, but that makes it sound like a problem. I think people are kind of like drawn into things because they can do them, and maybe like, I mean, like, I wouldn't call what I do either a calling or a compulsion or a vehicle. I'm not a creative artist, and that's not what you're asking about, but I'm just saying, like, I kind of felt like I couldn't do much else, or like nothing, like I wouldn't be able to kind of, I probably had the skills to like be a editor in a, but I couldn't, I don't think I could really work that way all the time. Like, I think sometimes it's a process of elimination for a lot of people. And I think all of these, I guess the reason I'm resistant is I think they're all romanticizing in a certain way, like self-expression, romanticizing, romanticizing.
Yeah. No, I love that word romanticizing. There's one McLuhan line that might fit a little. The Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can.
Yeah, we all do everything as well as we can.
But
doing our best.
But can art making be egoless?
I think it can be humble. And I think that's why, going back to your earlier question about who is a model, like that's why my great uncle, I think, inspired a lot of people, is that he seemed about as egoless as you can get as someone who's making, in his case, poetry. I think a little bit of ego is okay. I don't, in terms of having a sense of self. And I've found as a mentor that, with female students, for example, like getting them to have a sense of their confidence in themselves and their own voice and so forth, like that's worth cultivating, and it's important. Some young men seem to come by it more easily.
No, it's really good what you're saying, because this is one of my major questions, and I'll just tell you the history in a second, is that most people go, can art make me egoless? 80 to 90% go, no. And then about a year ago, a woman says, great art is egoless. And then about a month ago, a woman said, it has to be egoless. So it's a lot on how we define what the word ego is, because it's from a Jungian aspect. And then there's the thing like conceit and what you're talking about, because I was so impressed early on when you talked about your great uncle and you said his poetry felt egoless. And I was like, that's good. She's anticipating the question I'm going to ask in a half, upcoming. So let's move on. This is good. Tell me one major element of your creativeness, your output, your doings that's changed, and one major element that stayed the same in the years you've been doing this.
Mhm. Um, let's see. Well, I guess I can answer in practical things, or I'll say the same thing first. So what stayed the same is, I think, the way that I think of things I want to work on, or new topics I'm going to write on, or anything I do in my scholarly work is very much inspired by direct encounters with work of art and architecture that I just find powerful, or that I feel really compelled to think about, and I kind of can't stop thinking about. So, and that's not like some people work on, I'm a historian, and so a lot of historians start in the archive, and they have a kind of like um, instinct to find new archival documents, or to solve a problem. Like, we don't know who made this villa, and I want to figure out who made that villa. They have a conceptual problem, like I want to understand how is perspective invented, or something like that. And I don't do any of that. I'm very visual in that regard as well. Like, it's the things, the objects, or the buildings that get me started, and that kind of bring me back and keep me engaged over like scholarly projects. I'm a fast writer for reviews and art criticism and stuff, but I'm a very slow writer for books. So to stay engaged over time, you have to know what's driving you. And so for me, what I keep coming back to is that I'm working on objects, or works of art, or buildings that I just find so fascinating. So that's consistent. I guess one thing that's changed, and this is, I don't know that it's not changed in my scholarship, but just in what's been, I guess, a 20-year career, the last 10 years, I've been able to do this sideline of the art criticism, and that's changed my range as a writer, because it's meant that I'm like, it's like having two cars at different speeds, or having a bicycle and a car, or something like that. It's like I'm operating on different tracks simultaneously. And I think that's really good for me. I think it's really helped me also in my scholarly writing, kind of helped when you do an 800-word piece of criticism for a newspaper. There's often 4 people who are like looking at it and kind of wordsmithing every, like, what does this mean? Da, 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 like questioning everything. And so you have to really focus on clarity, and you have to focus on being super concise. And so I think that's had some positive carryovers to my scholarly writing as well. But it's also just meant that I have to, kind of like function on 2 tracks. And I like that.
Yeah, you write for a newspaper that has great writing. Let me tell you, I read a lot of newspapers and magazines, and that it's amazing how I've found several people for my podcast because they've written for the Wall Street Journal really good articles, and it's like, wow, I want to talk to this person. So Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Well, this is a kind of comical one, and I don't know if it's really what you have in mind. But so I alluded to earlier that I'm not good about left and right. So like I wear these different colored rings on my fingers so that I can remember that the blue one is on the left hand and the purple one is on the right hand. And early on, and so I'm old enough that when I started teaching, we had slides, and the way that you do work in a slide lecture room is you'd say next on the left, next on the right, and that was just like a total nightmare for me, because not only it was like, well, is it my left and right, which is hard enough, but then it's the audience's left and right. Like I just couldn't do it. And so I'd have to
Right.
say, like, on the far side, like I think, yeah, on the far side you see blah blah blah. On the close side, like I'd refer to them relative to my body. But I've wondered, and this is not saying it, this is not really the answer to your question, but I've wondered, because I've met some other people who have that left right thing, and like one's an architect, or a couple of them are architect, if maybe there's some other thing that I'm good at as a consequence. Like I'm really spatially aware and like
Yeah.
very perceptive about space and spatial memory, and have a great spatial imagination. And I've wondered if this inability might correspond to like some other thing I'm good at. It's not answering your question, but that's
No, it did really well, Cammy. It evokes something I wanted to say earlier. Is McLuhan has this great line: "We shape our tools, then they shape us." So we shaped this direction thing. We shaped rings. We shaped slide projectors. Then they shaped us. But he got that from rewording Winston Churchill, who said, "We shape our buildings, then they shape us." In being a professor of architecture, I goes, that's a great line, because we don't realize that buildings shape our human behavior. I mean, in general, we just, oh, this is the door and I go in here, and, this room's here and the doorway's there. And we don't realize how much buildings shape us. In fact, we don't realize how much any of our tools shape us. We just embrace them and go, okay, do your thing on us. And that's sort of what our study's about. But there's a curious line that goes, you create what you resist. And I'm not saying you, Cammy, but one creates what one resists. Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, said, you are what you hate. And James Joyce said, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, thank God I'm an atheist. So any thoughts on this line? You create what you resist. One creates what one resists.
you create what you resist. I'm not sure. I don't know I'm not sure what to do with that. I want to go back to something else you said, though.
Please.
Building up this thing about
we shape our buildings. Yeah.
Yeah, and they shape us. So it just reminded me of something that I read, and I used a little bit in my first book, but I also had a lot of thoughts on that I haven't come back to about. So it was so Heinrich Wölfflin, one of the most famous and earliest German art historians. He's mostly known for his writings about style, but I found this dissertation that he wrote, and it had been published, but then there was a translation published, and it was about architecture. I hadn't realized that his first scholarly writing was about architecture, and he was talking about breathing in relation to architecture, how you breathe differently in different spaces, and I thought this was so fascinating because I think it's true. Like I'm a tiny bit claustrophobic. And so like if I get into, too small an elevator, or if I get into a really low ceilinged room, like I don't panic, but I don't feel great. And like I want to get out of it. I'm sure that's not just me. But I'm also aware of, if you go into some he might have even talked about Palladio. I can't remember. It's been a while. But, if you go into some beautiful Palladian villa and it like has a high ceiling, it's like you kind of like take a breath, like and so what maybe Churchill, if that was the quote, said was probably thinking about our habits or, whatever. But it really resonated when I read this Wolflin thing, because I think it does have all these buildings do also have all these somatic, I think that's the right word, effects on our body and our senses that we probably are not fully aware of and are hard to articulate. And that was something that I was for a moment interested in what neuroscience was doing with art history, because I thought, well, that's something that, maybe could be measured, or maybe it could be, and I don't know if people have, then it just felt like hard to work with. I don't know, it felt like a avenue that I wasn't quite ready to pursue. But yeah, I think it's interesting the kind of multiple levels at which that statement is true.
Yeah, and the breathing thing was enlightening for me, for you to tell me that, because Duchamp's at a cocktail party and someone goes, "So what do you do?" And he goes, "I'm a breather."
Good answer.
Well, I'm a breather too. We have something in common. But conscious breathing is such an important thing. And it goes with the next question. How do you find peace of mind?
Being alone. I really need to spend part of the day alone and kind of be quiet with my thoughts. And I find like I really like to write by hand. If I so if I'm kind of like, if I feel like I have a lot going on in my head and I'm like I'm really my mind's going in a lot of directions, I sit down with a notebook and pen, and that really just kind of helps me feel like I know what's going on and kind of work things out. I also love like bike riding and walking. Those were, I can't remember something you said. Oh, maybe you referred to like, oh, I think it was a Joyce quote about epiphanies or something like that. I find that when I bike to work usually, and when I'm biking, I always like have some idea that seems great. Well, it may or may not turn out to be great, but it feels like this amazing thing. And it happens when I go for walks too. I love swimming, and the same things happens when I swim, but I haven't been swimming a lot lately. Yeah.
That's really good. I take hopefully 3 bike rides a day, and I'm the same way. The wheel turning has something to do with your brain thinking great ideas, and it's just like amazing. I totally agree. I asked for 90 minutes, Cammy, and it's gone by so fast. Can you go another 5 or 10, or you got to go now?
Sure. No, I can give you another 5 or 10. Sure.
That's really sweet of you. I appreciate it. If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
It's going to be fine. I think I had a lot of, I don't know, worries. I wasn't a super anxious kid, but I don't know. I think I had a lot of ambitions and worries, and didn't know if I was good enough at anything. And I think some of it came from kind of like growing up in the provinces, like, Iowa City was culturally very sophisticated in many ways, and I was like meeting all these famous people and like whatever. But I was very aware that I was in this kind of like peripheral part of the U.S. and I think I felt like, maybe I don't know if I was missing out, or I felt like there were just bigger things happening elsewhere. I mean, I had this aunt in New York and like, cousins in Chicago and so on. So I think I felt like, yeah, I don't know. I think I felt some anxiety about like my future, and I tell myself that it would be fine.
Good. These are 5 quick Alan Watts questions just off the top of your head in a few words. First one, who started it all?
No idea.
Are we going to make it?
We'll be fine.
Where do we put it?
Again, I don't know.
4, who's cleaning it up?
Sadly, I think it'll be our children.
5, is it serious?
Not at all.
Beautiful. If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
Oh, I hope they don't. I'm a scholar. I don't need to write about myself.
If a statue was built in your honor, where would you want it displayed and what would it be made of?
I'm good. I don't need a statue.
Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good?
You never had it, but you never
Okay.
want it.
Let's see. Skydiving?
I've had that answer. That is a legitimate answer. What's the cultural shift you see developing today that's inspired you?
I think some people think this is bad, but I think it's good. So like, I think there's a huge amount of creativity, kind of creative ownership that really young kids are taking through things like TikTok and even Snapchat and like their phones. I mean, I have a 10-year-old daughter, and she doesn't have her own phone, but just borrowing mine over the summer when we were traveling, she started taking all these fabulous photos. And like my other 2 kids who are a little older and do have phones, like would do all these crazy TikTok dances, like just for their, like in private accounts, just for their friends.
Yeah.
And when they have friends over, like all 3 of them at various points would make videos with like make movies with the iPad using, so these are all technology things, which I think there's a lot of weird hysteria about, but I see it as it's a creative medium, and a lot of kids seem to be using it that way. So that seems really exciting.
It's very exciting. It's very cool. So I think it's McLuhan that said this. For James Joyce has solved numerous problems which science has not formulated as problems. So it's sort of like, what literature has done, what art has done with science. I'm curious, in your pursuits in art and architecture, what's a problem that remains unresolved for you? Or maybe you could even shift it from problem to question. What's a question or a problem that remains unresolved for you in the big picture view of how art and architecture study has shaped your behavior?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think well, I guess I can think of 2 things. One is this, going back to what I was saying before about just kind of like the problem of how you put into words anything about how we experience art and architecture. But I think the other one is maybe going back to well, a little goes back to your very first question about kind of, I think you said collect information and I said collect objects, but like why these things have such a powerful effect on us. So, I mean, one thing that I would think about is not just architecture, but cities. Like, I think that we haven't really thought about, or I mean, there are, urban historians and so forth, but I think maybe in the popular culture and in the kind of public perception in the US, there's not enough thought about how, or discussion in the public realm about how the shape of our cities and our experience of cities kind of like affects our daily life. I think a lot of us, I think it came out a bit, and I hope it follows through during COVID, because like people were walking more, and there was a lot of like restaurants and established moved into the streets, so there were more pedestrian zones, and people had to get out of their houses a lot because they couldn't go anywhere else, and so there was kind of like a slightly shifted consideration of the public realm. And one thing that I think about a lot, because I spend a lot of time in Italy or in Europe, is just how incredibly rewarding and rich the experience of kind of like walking around many of those cities is, and how, I mean, it's one thing I like about Boston is it has a real downtown and you can kind of walk around it, or love when I'm in New York, Central Park and so forth. But a lot of American cities have, had downtowns and destroyed them, and aren't very walkable. And I wouldn't say this is like, I mean, there are a lot of, urbanists and urban historians and architects who think about these things, but I don't think it's filtered enough into kind of like what mayors are talking about, or what politicians are talking about, or what's considered in the public realm. I think there could be a lot more consideration of the kind of common shared spaces in our cities and how they can just like benefit everybody's well-being.
Common shared space is beautifully put, because I live in another Venice, California, and we are so walkable in certain areas. We have walk streets where there's no cars. It's just a sidewalk with houses. And McLuhan wrote an amazing book called The City as Classroom. So, he's like the museum without walls, center without margins. But do you know, I can't think of her name. You might know her. She's an icon in tackling the big bad landlords of New York City. And they made a documentary of
Jane Jacobson, probably.
Jane Jacobson. Did you know she made an experimental film with Marshall McLuhan?
Oh, I have. That's fabulous to know. I didn't know that.
It's on YouTube, and it's funny because the documentary was good, but they didn't even mention it. But it is a funny little twist in all this. So Thornton, that was really well put. I love both of those things you talked about. The common shared space. I mean, that's the great thing about my town, Venice. I can ride my bike, and all of a sudden I'm talking to one person, then I'm talking to the next person, and it's a small town, but it's in the middle of this huge, LA, which people think, oh, LA's horrible, and you got Marina del Rey on one side of Venice, and you got, Santa Monica on the other end. So the beauty of Venice is that you can have a homeless wino junkie next to a millionaire movie director and not tell the difference. It's like everybody's like accepting of each other. And in the midst of all that, being a small town, 1 million people walk through our town once a month, because it's a bigger tourist trap than Disneyland, because it's free and it's next to the ocean, so you're breathing clean air. So it is a kind invite. If you're ever in Venice, California, I'll give you a tour of all our great architecture and art.
Excellent.
So this is Thornton Wilder in 1928. He said, art is confession, art is the secret told, but art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. You've laid your cards on the table for over 90 minutes. Cammy, I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this. What's it really all about for you?
Um, I don't know. I think so. I think about I was visiting some friends in upstate New York the other weekend, and they're in like finance in a totally different walk of life in terms of what they do as a profession. And I hadn't ever been to Dia Beacon, so it was like 15 minutes away. So I suggested we go, and I and one of my friend's husband was like, we got there and he was like, I don't know who these artists are. And we were there with also our kids. And at first I was thinking like, okay, so I'm going to be like, it's going to be a lot of explaining I'm going to be doing. But then it was really a joy because it was a very, it was the kids and my friends were like very receptive. And there were so many things I loved there. And my friend was like, Cammy, that was so interesting to see this with you. And I was amazed how fast you walked through some of those rooms. And I was like, well, I know what I like. I love some of these artists and I don't want to waste time on the people that I don't love. But it was really, and this is not my stuff. It was like, it's all, modern and contemporary artists, but there's so many of them that I really find fabulous. And it was such a pleasure to share that. And I think it was meaningful to them, and even my kids who can be very skeptical about museums with the mother that they have, found things that, like I asked them, everybody to find one thing that they liked and tell me why. And they did a great job with that. So I think for me, I've been lucky to find something I really find joy and pleasure in. And if I can share that through teaching or through writing or just visiting museums or cities with friends, that feels like I'm doing the right thing.
Yeah. No, I agree totally. I walk fast through art museums too, and people are like, "You're an art guy." It's like, nope, I don't want to waste my time on this. I know I'm discerning. I think that's what you want. I'm going to use that question. Find one. I can use that question for everything. Find one thing that you like and tell us why. That's really good. The last question is, what gives you the most optimism?
I mean, my kids give me a lot of optimism. Like they're so, and when I talk to their friends too, just like, there's so many things they're curious about and they're using this technology creatively. They're very, worried about the environment, but kind of like focused on finding, environmental concerns and climate and so forth, but like focused on finding solutions. And I feel like my students as well, they're very kind of socially minded in a way, like they're, and I don't mean like socializing. I mean like interested in the common good or like collective problems in a way that I find encouraging.
Yep. That is the answer I get the most, and it's so encouraging. People say youth, young, they're children. So, the first question is, what's the best thing for a human being? And Wilhelm Reich is where I got the question from, and he said the best thing for a human being is another human being. So I love how you summarized this whole thing, went full circle, because your first answer was loving what you do and the people I care about, and people. And the last question is, what gives you the most optimism? I got that from the last question they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life. And he said, other people. So it's sure been fun spending this time with another person. Cammy, thank you so much. It was really enlightening for me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I look forward to your future books, and especially your future articles in the Wall Street Journal. What a pleasure reading those. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope we can keep talking forever and ever.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you so much.
Bye.